when you first kind of make this transition from Motorola, you've got a lot of motivations, a lot of reasons for wanting to leave Motorola and kind of strike out into something new, right?
Right.
And Chuck has kind of, at this point, uh, started to lay some groundwork. Now, I know that at one point you and Chuck talked with people in Motorola. Was that something that Chuck had been really kind of intending to do initially, or was he really kind of always thinking about breaking out to something else?
Well, that's a very interesting question, Brian, and actually something that hasn't really been touched on in other interviews and or articles and things. Chuck coming to Motorola in 73, this is at the end of the 6800 program. It's at basically the end of putting together the system on chips. So there's multiple chips. There's the ACIA, there's a modem chip, there's a PIA, which is the general purpose digital interface. You got the microprocessor itself. So when Chuck came there, he came there because they were looking for somebody to validate, you could say, these systems on chips, multiple chips. And Chuck was a systems engineer that worked on a point of sale terminal. He worked at General Electric Computer in Phoenix. And so he knew the system stuff. And that's why Motorola hired him. They wanted somebody to validate, are we doing the right thing with the 6800 program?
Mm-hmm.
So Chuck came along, and one of the key things is, how do you interface a microprocessing system to the real world? Well, the PIA is part of it. The ACIA is part of it. The modem is part of it. And then you have the microprocessor, CPU, and you have RAM for data, and you have ROM for program. And so he knew this. He knew what to do here because he was already working with, let's say, small scale integrated circuits, logic elements, to build the control functions for his systems. Because Motorola was one of the first in the integrated circuit world. And so you see that at that point, Chuck is learning what's possible by being real close to semiconductor engineers. So we're celebrating Chuck, and this time about 45 years ago is when we introduced the 6502, 6501, 6502, 6530 two-chip system. All of this came about 45 years ago. But when Chuck shows up in 73, this is a whole new world for him because he wasn't close to semiconductor engineers, but now he saw how this fit together. So if he, knowing a few different instruction sets and could read manuals, he would see, hey, we can do whatever I want to do. And I got a hotshot little young engineer here called Bill, and his ego would say, we're going to be successful because that guy's not going to quit until it's working right. And that's how we fit together. I'm the semiconductor engineer. He's the systems engineer. So my technology enabled Chuck to do what he wanted to do with a small system, like what happened in about 76, 77 timeframe was the PET. But now go back to your question. Did Chuck think he was going to come in there and raid Motorola to build the processor he wanted? And I have a feeling if he didn't really think those thoughts, that it was there someplace. Because when I proposed in 1973 the home computer, Chuck was like, we're not doing that, which tells me that he was thinking of doing that.
Right.
It's like,
it's somewhere it had already gone through his head. Yeah.
Yeah. And so when this upshot young engineer is saying this, he's saying, I don't want you talking about that because that's a good idea, but we just don't know how we're going to do it yet. And so that's what my interpretation of his attempt at intimidating me in December of 1973. And see, the other part of it is that his story tells me that he was talking to others when he'd be on trips. He'd be on marketing trips. If you watch his videos, there's one I really like that I have on my website that is a link to his 21-minute talk at the in Boston, when he was introducing the Victor 9000. But anyhow, coming back to Motorola days, so did he come in thinking he was going to raid Motorola? Well, that's what he ended up doing a year later. But he came to me to put together the team. So when I said, well, we need Rod Orgel, we got to have Rod Orgel. Rod and I worked on the Olivetti chip. We worked on the 6800. He worked on Precisa calculator chip. He knows processors. He knows logic. He's one of the best logicians at Motorola that I've run into. Rod, we need Rod. And we need a couple of layout designers. And I only have one of them that I ever worked with on the PIA. So this green layout designer, I worked with him. But when it got tough in the corner, I did the layout in the corner to make that fit the die size we were looking for. And so I know how to do layout, but I'm not a layout designer, but I know how to work with layout designers. And if it gets tough, I know I can lay out that part of it, but I'm hoping I never have to do that, because there's a lot of other things that a semiconductor engineer has to get involved with. So that's the story. So did he come there to raid Motorola? Maybe. He did that. So at the end of the day, he did raid Motorola.
Well, so whether it was on his mind at the beginning or not is not clear, but pretty quickly he realized that was a good idea.
Yeah, and see, Motorola, there was something else that was going on in the background that I didn't know about, but maybe Chuck knew about. As it turns out, the 68,000 team, just like at Intel, they'll have, to turn out a new microprocessor every 2 years, they have at least 2 teams, maybe 3 or 4 teams. And so if it takes 8 years, you might have 4 teams that every 2 years you can introduce a new product. That's what Motorola was doing behind the scenes. They had a 68,000 team built up while we were doing the 6800. Now, I didn't know about this at the time, but if Chuck knew about it, he knew they were going big, not small.
Right.
Now, when they moved to Austin, they went small. The 6805 is a 1 chip with a subset or whatever of the 6800 instruction. So you know that they were probably thinking of that, but how does Chuck's story fit with what actually happened? I'd say he wanted to strike out on his own. He wanted to raid Motorola. He did that. And I was his lead semiconductor engineer that just loved designing.
So is it likely then that he made the initial contacts with MOS technology on those trips that you were talking about?
I don't think so. When we were getting together with Paul Barossa at Paul Barossa's house on the north side of Camelback Mountain in Stone Canyon, I think is where his home was. When we get together with Paul, he was wanting Paul to be a partner with whatever we did. So Paul was a professor at UCLA before, I think. He had several different business cards. So Paul was the go-to guy, the way Chuck saw it. So he never really talked about MOS technology in any of those meetings, because at some point, Chuck just decides Paul's not going to be able to deliver the next opportunity for us. So we're going to have to figure it out on our own. That's when he started thinking, well, I know this guy, John Pavinen, that I worked with at GE, and somehow he connected up those dots. Wait a minute, John's got a place back in MOS in Pennsylvania, in Valley Forge Corporate Center. And I'm going, hey, I don't care. I don't care where we design. All I want to do is design a chip that we know is going to be better than what we just worked on.
Yeah, transistors are the same whether it's Arizona or Philadelphia,
Exactly. And I'm going home, although that wasn't really that high on my list.
Right. Yeah, just uh, in fact, I had a similar experience myself where I ended up going back to the area where I grew up at one point, and it was not, yeah, that wasn't a motivating factor. It just turned out to be a convenience.
Yeah, just kind of fit together that way. But what's
Yeah.
interesting is I don't believe, because I wasn't part of the decision on going to MOS. I was no part of that. And so what happens is, but when we get back there, it's like we just we just stepped into a pot of gold, or we just stepped into an awesome opportunity. And it was quite it was random. In my
Mm-hmm.
opinion, it was totally random. And as a calculator company that was had a metal gate PMOS process, and we're going to a silicon gate depletion load process.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they're like, okay, they're still an FET, field effect
Yeah.
transistor process, but it's a whole new process.
Yeah. Very different. Yeah. And so when you guys got in there, now I gather that there was a certain sense of, okay, who are these guys coming in here into our turf that was going on there?
Yeah. There were a lot of people unhappy about the decision by John Pavinin, the
Mm-hmm.
president. He knew Chuck, and Chuck and he were friends. I remember this. Uh, he was a country club kind of a guy. The first time we got together for dinner was at his country club. So it just
Mm-hmm.
the quality of and the camaraderie between Chuck and John Pavinin is that's what fused it. But
Mm-hmm.
basically everybody else thought this was a bad idea. Now I'd say that Mort Jaffe, the financial guy, he was just a good guy. I guess financial guys are just good guys. They just want to make money. And hey, if John thinks this is going to work, hey, I'm not going to complain. But if
Mm-hmm.
the engineering guy would say, well, what's the deal? I mean, we know how to design processors. I mean, don't you know that there's a processor in a calculator? I mean, Intel would claim 50 years ago that the first microprocessor was really a calculator processor. And you go, dude, Motorola was designing calculator chips before Intel was, working with the Europeans. Intel was working with the Japanese. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
all these things fit together in my mind that says John made a decision to go with these cowboys from Motorola, from the West, over his own guys. But that's because Chuck convinced him that because he worked on this point of sale terminal and some of these other small systems, that he knew the instruction set that would be a winner. And because he worked at Motorola, you use that experience to
Mm-hmm.
pick an instruction set that is going to be more effective than the previous one. And that's what engineers do.
So essentially, it sounds like what got you guys in there really was Chuck convincing John that you all could do a better product
Yeah.
than the group he already had.
Right. And I think probably Chuck says you can't use that PMOS process. You need an
Mm-hmm.
NMOS process. So we know NMOS. I can see
Right.
Chuck saying, we know NMOS, and we're going to go with depletion loads. The other guys aren't using depletion loads. Bill knows how to do that. Bill
Right.
already had that all figured out at Motorola. Motorola didn't want to do it. We'll do it here. And we're passionate about making this happen. And
Yeah.
that's Chuck.
I can really see how that could have ruffled the feathers of the engineers who are already there.
Oh, they were all pissed.
Yeah, I can imagine they must have been.
I had
Um,
3 flat tires in my first week.
oh my.
But you don't know whether it was going out and looking for a new house that might have had some nails in the.
Yeah, yeah. It's always hard to say for sure where that came from, but it is suspicious.
Well, it happens. But the other comment that said I may be on the right track is when one of the guys says, uh, "You don't want to mess with the Godfather." And I go, "Was the Godfather here someplace?"
Yeah.
He was talking about Don McLaughlin, I think.
Okay.
But it was never revealed who the Godfather was. But then you go, well, we're back here in Philadelphia, and things happen in New Jersey and New York, and it's a different Wild West back here.
That's true. That is true. So then you all get there, and so Chuck has essentially at this point laid out a roadmap for where to go. You're diving in enthusiastically working on this, and a lot of it then is not targeted towards specific products, of course. You're thinking we want a chipset basically that other designers are going to pick up and realize that they would rather use this than the 6000 or the 8080.
Right. Right. And it's going to be simpler to work with. And Will Mathis wrote the hardware manual. Chuck wrote the software manual, which made it easy for people to pick up the technology.
Mm-hmm.
And simplicity, simple elegance, the 6502 known as simple elegance in a microprocessor. That's why it's popular with the hackers and the makers. And, of course, nowadays you use Arduino, Raspberry Pi, but back in the day, the
Right.
6502 is what Wozniak was attracted to because he could make
Mm-hmm.
things happen.
So you all joined moved over to MOS technology in 74, right?
Right.
And
August 19th,
August
1974.
19th.
The same day we were off the payroll at Motorola, we're on the payroll at MOS. So our travel
That
time,
works out well.
yeah, it worked out great.
Yeah. So then how long was it before you turned silicon on the 6502?
Well, we introduced it a year later, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that means we actually had silicon probably in working parts in about the June, July timeframe. And then we had to get the 6530 out too. So then
Mm-hmm.
I'm the design engineer of the 6530 chip. Because Chuck, the goal of the 6502 was not to be competing with the 8080 or the 6800. I don't know if you knew that.
No. So what was the goal then?
To compete with the 4040. So if you go back and
Oh.
look at the history at Intel, it was a 4-bit processor called the 4040.
Mm-hmm.
That's why we're selling it for $25 for the 6502. We're getting $5 more because the chip is the same chip. The 6501 was $20. So we're getting
Mm-hmm.
$5 more for the same chip, just have a different metal layer. That's all it was. Same size, everything was the same. Same number of transistors on both of them, except that about 12 of the transistors aren't hooked up on the 6501,
Mm-hmm.
but are on the 6502. So the 4040 was a 2-chip system selling for $29. So if you're going to compete with the 4040, you're going to be in the 20s. And that means
Right.
that we have to figure out how to get this $20 CPU. And if you look at the chip size or the chip set for the Atari 2600 with the 6507 and the 6532, you're looking at something that I don't know what the pricing was for those 2 chips, but I have a feeling they were lower priced than the 4040 chipset. So when we introduce the 6502, we're introducing the chips that were used on the Kim 1.
Mm-hmm.
6502 plus the two 6530 chips, one for the keyboard or the keypad interface, and one for the teletype interface. So that program, 1K bytes of program was needed for the interface, the monitor, for the keypad, and separately 1K for the monitor for the teletype. So that's how that worked. So we're not competing with the 6800 because we want more volume.
Mm-hmm.
Lower cost, higher volume, more things. So to go to a pet computer that was a whole new market is what was Chuck thinking? Right?
Right. Well, I mean, yeah, you were already going after what amounted to the microcontroller market.
Right.
And, as we know, there's always more controllers out there than there are personal computers.
Order of magnitude, orders of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Yeah, I guess I never really thought in terms of the 6501 and the 6502 being really kind of directed at different markets. But it kind of makes sense.
Well, yeah, I never related to it just the way you did just now. But yeah, the 6501 was competing with the 6800. 6502 was competing with the 4040.
And you were able to basically take one design
Right.
and go after two different markets with it.
Right.
That's impressive.
Well, back in the day, it was just, if you were there in the day and you saw what we saw it all. Rod and I saw it all. Chuck saw his thing and Will saw his. Will is an awesome applications engineer. That's why he wrote the hardware manual. Will, he was a logician. He knew how to apply chips. So he was a great member of the team. Now, I didn't recruit Will. Chuck recruited Will out of the applications department, that's where I got started at Motorola, out of University of Arizona. But Will was an awesome team member, just awesome. And so the combination of Chuck and Will and Rod, because Rod worked on calculator chips and 6800 and Olivetti chip. And so Rod knew basic microprocessor technology or processing technology, but Rod taught me, he was my mentor in logic design. And so that's how that all fits together. And Mike and Harry as mask designers, and then Sid Holt, she came along from back there. But Mike and Harry was a very good mask designer, and he was fast. And Mike was a very good mask designer, but he was more methodical. So if you wanted something done quickly, give it to Harry. If you wanted something done with more accuracy, you give it to Mike. But then Mike was always going back and cleaning up somewhat. Now, if Harry was on this, and when Harry sees this, he's going to probably, Harry and I don't know if there's any love there, but I think I would say love-hate, but it could be mostly hate. Anyhow, but I could go into stories, but Harry is an awesome guy. I love Harry. We got together after he came back west and worked at Motorola. We got together once. He built an airplane. He's got a wonderful story. Harry's got an awesome story to tell. And anyhow, there you go.
Yeah. That's it's interesting, you come in, and so in less than a year, you've not only introduced a new architecture, you've got new processes, and as we talked about, you've got these significant improvements in the way the process is implemented that really substantially improves your yields. And all this happens in less than a year.
Mm-hmm.
And then you hit the market with this. You go to the show and announce this thing. And I love the story that I heard you telling in another setting, where you had these like bowls of the chips.
Oh, they were actually they were big jars.
Okay.
They were like these mason jars like you might find pickles in at a bar, a big old jar. Those jars were filled, and, at the time, I don't even know if they were all tested, but there was a bunch of chips in the jar. And they were probably tested, but right now Chuck likes telling the story. The ones on the bottom didn't work, but who would know that looking at the jar, right? But anyhow, there's
So do you
one
have like a
jar,
6501 jar?
yeah, and 6502 jars.
Okay, excellent. And so when people would come to the hotel and go, okay, I really want one of these right now, were they actually,
Yeah,
buying it
pick
out
them
of the jar?
Yeah. Well, they thought they all worked, and they
Yeah.
probably left. Yeah, my chips always had the higher yield than the next guy's chips, and if they weren't tested, they probably more than half of them worked. But
Hmm.
but nowadays, my chips that we have manufactured now, 99% are good after packaging, and we never probe them. 99% good.
I'm not a process engineer, but I'm impressed by that.
Yeah, I'm impressed because it's the manufacturer, TSMC manufactures them.
Yeah. Wow. That's, yeah, I guess it's a whole different world. Um, so you all then, this thing comes onto the market, and, obviously you're blowing everybody away with this price point.
Well, quite a
And
stir.
yeah. Uh, and now, when was the show? That was later in '75, right?
It was in September. It's like right now.
September. Okay.
Like actually, probably last week, 45 years ago.
All right. So 45 years ago, last week is the show.
Yeah.
You all have been there now just over a year.
Yeah.
And so at this point, I'm guessing, is Chuck thinking about what's going to become the pet at this point?
Well, okay. Of course, I don't know what Chuck is thinking, right?
Okay.
I mean, Chuck, I don't even know if Chuck knows what he was thinking because Chuck is just, he's awesome. And we're celebrating Chuck. He passed away last December 15th.
Hmm.
Uh, but so we want to celebrate it. So, anything I say about Chuck has got to be something good. And
Of course.
I don't know that I have anything bad to say about him. Chuck is Chuck, and he's unique. He's one of a kind. It's like Steve Jobs was Steve Jobs.
Yeah.
Some people can say negative things about Steve Jobs, but these characters that got started with the 6502 are just awesome. They're characters, but they were breaking the mold of what came before.
Hmm.
So Chuck was that. So when you ask, was he thinking pet when we were introducing the 6502 in 1975? Well, he bolted from MOS the next year when Commodore acquired MOS. And so he's not even on the East Coast in 76, he's on the West Coast. So to me, that's 3 years after we talked about a home computer. So my guess is that from that day forward, even though he's going, we're not going to do that, I think he was going to do that.
Hmm. Right. And then once the chipset was now available,
Yeah,
you could begin putting the pieces together.
right.
You mentioned that the Commodore takeover then is in '76. So you've got another fairly quick sequence of events that ultimately led to that. Um, so where did all that begin?
Well, I'm missing. What do you mean?
Oh, well, so the uh, the involvement with Commodore.
Oh,
So at the very beginning, it's Commodore is coming to you asking about calculator chips, right?
oh. Yes. And so what happened there is, so I leave MOS, going to start my own company, but didn't know what I was doing. And some people would still say today, Bill doesn't know what he's doing. And there's some accuracy in that. But anyhow, so I'm going to start the company, but Rod doesn't want to work with me anymore. So he wasn't necessarily happy with me and my attitude, and especially after I win the bet. So there could have been some friction there. So Ray is there, and he actually fell in love with a woman that was a test engineer there, and he married her, and I was the best man in their wedding. But Ray then, at some point later, after he sends me the tester, Ray is how I got the tester. Ray's back there when he sends me the tester, and they replaced it with a Century 700. And anyhow, so this is part of that story. But what happened then is Terry Holt. Now, there's another part of the story here that isn't really told. And that is, what was the employment agreement that we had as a team? Wild West, I mean, the Cowboys coming from the West. What kind of agreement did Chuck put together to get us all to think this was a good idea?
That's a good question.
Yeah. It was a percentage of the profits.
Uh-huh.
We each had our own percentage of the profit. Do you think there was ever any profit? No. There was never any profit. And when someone started relating to that, and I have a feeling Rod and Terry, I don't know about Mike, but maybe Mike, Harry, maybe. I never related to, hey, I like the idea, let's make a lot of money. We got everything's working towards a lot of profit. Mm-hmm. But then you don't realize that this is a new market, and Chuck was always being bugged by the leadership team at MOS saying, give me what you're going to actually make happen with all these controllers. So Will and Chuck were out there trying to find applications that would generate the volume to replace the calculator business, which is basically now not happening. Mm-hmm. So that's when it switched from calculators to computers. So what happened there was that Chuck couldn't make the controller business happen fast enough to keep MOS viable. And that's when Jack came along. We're going to build computers, and we're going to build this and whatever they decided in the West Coast. But what the surprise was for Chuck is Al Charpentier and these other guys that were working on the VIC-20 and the Commodore 64, they knew how to build low-cost, really, relatively speaking, high-performance audio and video attached to what basically is the 6502. So when you look at that, Chuck is out on the West Coast without a semiconductor engineer, so to speak. So the East Coast has the VIC-20 and the Commodore 64. They're looking at the consumer market for computers, mm-hmm. which is a combination of the Atari game and a keyboard. So the other ones are just joysticks, but now we have a keyboard. So that makes that different, and that makes it fun for somebody that wants to make something new happen. So what Apple, working with their investment bankers, etc., said, we need to come up with an answer for Commodore. And so they called that a consumer computer, and the Apple was a home computer. Mm-hmm. But then what happened was IBM then says, well, there's more people in a home, so that's a personal computer. So they said personal computers because there's 4 times as many computers. And
Yeah.
so the home computer idea is a good idea, but a personal computer is a better idea. And a consumer computer says you're going to sell it at a cost. And so their price point was like, I was a distributor for Apple at one point where I was buying $3,000 Apple IIs as a workstation for my 65 CO2 development team. Anyhow, the 816, I was using Apples, and so I was a distributor of Apples, so I got them for like $2,000 and sold them for $3,000. I think I lost money on that. But anyhow, you see what happens here is Apple says a real computer sells for $2,000, $3,000, and Commodore selling for $200 to $300, so they can't be in the same market. So they're a consumer computer, and we don't have any interest in that. So that's how they set up the market, and that's how Jobs then is saying, no, we're going to build bigger computers, and that's the Macintosh.
Right. So the time frame on this, when was it that you left MOS Technology?
About March 1977.
Okay. And so that would have been just a few months, I guess, after the acquisition?
Yeah, Commodore acquired MOS in 76, and I'm not sure, maybe the fall of 76.
Okay. So that all was all happening really fast. You get there in August 75, September 76.
No.
You introduce
August
74.
74.
Right, 74, and then September 75 is the show where the 6502 and 6501 are introduced.
Right.
And sometime about a year later, fall of 76 is when Commodore purchases MOS Technology, and then you're out of there in the spring of 77.
Right.
And this is the point where you had already put together a plan for what would become Western Design Center, right?
Correct.
But where did you go immediately, though?
Okay. So I'm realizing Rod doesn't want to work with me anymore. Will doesn't want to work with me anymore. Chuck's out of there. Mike and Harry are out of there. And you go, well, we kind of disintegrated. And nobody wants to work with me. And I thought that was a good idea that they didn't work with me because I didn't know what I was doing. I was trying to put together, I had a little business plan. I have it down in Arizona. I'm here in Colorado now. But anyhow, I'd show you the business plan. But anyhow, the business plan was about designing integrated circuits and just getting paid for that. There was no starting a company that was going to license microprocessors. I got that idea from Glenn Madeline. And so I'm realizing I don't know what I'm doing. That's probably a good thing. So then I don't know how ICE came up on the radar screen, but integrated circuit engineering, I decide that's where I want to design integrated circuits because they were the first in that business. Integrated circuit engineering started by Glenn Madeline. I gave you a link to that one. By the way, that's the first time I saw that link at the Smithsonian. That is fascinating. You can spend a lot of time looking at that link. And I'm going to put that link on my website. But anyhow, Glenn Madeline is the one, and he's the one that said, well, Bill, we'd like you to put on a seminar called Microprocessors for Management or Industry. And I'm going, wait a minute, you want me to stand in front of a group of people and tell the story about microprocessors so these managers will get it? Okay, that's what you want me to do. Also, because he was a training company. If you drill into that link at the Smithsonian, you'll see it's fascinating information. So that's where I ended up at ICE. And then I said, well, I came here, I want to design integrated circuits. And he said, well, actually, if you design an integrated circuit and it doesn't work, then I'm in trouble. I'm going, well, my chips work. Yeah, but that's a risk I don't need to take. But if you stand in front of someone and they pay me, I'm making money. It doesn't have to work. I go, okay. And he says, I actually sell my work product 3 ways. What? Well, someone gives me a contract to create this understanding of the technology. I get paid for that. Then I get paid for putting on these seminars. And then I sell it in book form. This is when we had books. Anyhow, I go, oh, that's interesting. So you sell the same thing 3 different ways. Okay. So then I'm thinking, if I sold a design 10 different ways, like a microprocessor, I could sell it to 10 different people. That would be even better than what Glenn's doing. That ended up being my business model. Well, I've sold the 6502 60 plus different ways. So that was better. And licensing with royalties and all that stuff. So it was a much better model than Glenn's model, but Glenn is who taught me that.
So basically your stint there really kind of set the stage. You had a business plan and a model in mind originally, but it really morphed in that intermediate experience.
Yes, big time. Because not only did I do that, but back in the day, this is before TSMC. This is before UMC. But UMC and TSMC were first funded by the World Bank. Glenn was the one that was helping them put together what now is a powerhouse of fabless foundries. Glenn was behind that. And so he was the advisor to the World Bank to put together TSMC and UMC, and I don't know who else. I don't know the details. All I know is because I worked there, I saw this foundry stuff coming up. I saw a microprocessor. I knew what I wanted to do there. And so then how do you got to license it. So then I started the IP model for microprocessors. But then the foundries say, well, why don't I be a fabless semiconductor company? So I was the first microprocessor company as a fabless company. So these are all things because I was there. And if you were there at the time, you would see that. It wasn't, as they say, it wasn't rocket science. It was just, you knew that was going to happen.
Yeah, being in the right place as the pieces are starting to fall and you kind of realize where they're going to land. And then being able to take advantage of that and to put yourself into the position to catch the right subset of pieces and do something with them.
Yeah.
So what was the time frame then for when you did start WDC?
Well, it was 78. I met with Jack and Chuck in Las Vegas at, I think, the Dunes Hotel casino. So Jack would go there. He liked to gamble. So when I show up, Jack and Chuck are at a blackjack table. So I show up on a Saturday, let's say early afternoon, whatever. But I'm going to fly up because this is a Saturday and Mother's Day is on a Sunday. So my mother of my children will want me home. And I had 3 children. When I started the company, I had 3 children under the age of 6. Anybody that talked to me, they'd go, "Are you crazy?" And you go, "No." But they say, "Well, you can't do that." I go, "Well, that's a good, you're saying I can't do this. Why can't I do it?" Well, the design companies all have to be part of the manufacturing companies. I said, and so why is that? Well, you need to have that exchange with the process engineers. I said, well, I define processes for Motorola, MOS.
Yeah.
I actually designed an ECL triple diffuse process in 3 months as a trainee. And I go, okay, so what's the other problem that I'm going to have? Well, you don't know anything about business. Yeah, you got me there, but I think people just want me to design for them, and that's what Jack did. So when Jack shows up, it's a handshake deal. He never signed any document. I did, but he didn't. And so it's on this handshake. And Jack, I said earlier when we were just having a conversation before you start recording, Jack put a lot of people out of business, and he put me into business. And so I'm thinking, Jack, here's how we're going to do it. I'm going to put together a timeline with milestone payments. And then what I'll do is, because my profit will be off the royalties. So I'll break even. So I'm going to ask you for money twice a month. You send me the money, and then any chip I design is going to go into high volume. So my profit is going to be off the royalties. Oh, okay. I said, so I'm not doing anything profitably other than my salary until you're into high volume production. So it's a win-win at that point.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how I got in business. Jack is saying, well, okay, I'll give you a couple options. You can have a department in engineering. Okay. Or you can be the vice president of engineering, and I'll pay you more than I pay Chuck. Chuck at this point is going, Chuck is realizing he can't really say anything, but he is now at this point pissed that Jack would offer me more than Chuck was getting. He says, or the third one, you start your own business. I said, well, when I got on the airplane this morning, there's only one option for me, my own company, and that's the company I defined in 76.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the deal I want. Okay, so let's go back and make some more money at the blackjack table. I'm going, that works for me. But you know what, Jack? I really need to get back to Phoenix. So you go ahead and make money. When I got to the blackjack table, both Jack and Chuck were losing money. Jack was down by, I'm thinking, about $10,000. In about 15 minutes, he's up by $17,000. Chuck is still losing, but Chuck is betting $20 a hand or whatever, but Jack's betting thousands of dollars a hand.
Wow.
I'm there, and he says, well, I think this is a good time to talk because you brought me good luck. That's how we go to his room, and there's Jack's across from me, Chuck sitting to my right on a chair, and I'm sitting there, and that's how the negotiation went down. So when Jack wants to go make some more money, I think he wanted me to go with him because I brought him luck. But I said, Jack, I need to catch the next plane back to Phoenix. So good luck with it. And hey, I'm looking forward to doing this. So I'm going to give my notice. So I gave my 2-week notice to ICE, and so I think it's a Saturday would be the 26th is when I call that the first day, but it was a Saturday, or it was a Friday, but the 26th of May is the first.
So when you finally did get all the pieces into place and Western Design was formed, you were already directly connected with Commodore in the sense that you kind of had a customer already in place.
Yeah, and a big piece of that, the glue, was Chuck. The glue was Chuck. Because Chuck and calculator chips, see what happens is calculator chips went from PMOS to CMOS. they didn't have a CMOS factory back in Pennsylvania. They had a CMOS factory called Frontier or Pioneer or something like that in Southern California. It was a CMOS factory that Commodore ran. So they had a guy there, but the guy that was there, I'm not sure what his strength was, his core competencies, but I think his name was Max. I'm not sure about that. But anyhow, he was who I reported to, but the guy that I really reported to was Bud Fry. He was the vice president of Commodore. And there was a guy back in Pennsylvania that I also reported to. But Chuck was the glue. Chuck was the reason why, you could say, I got in business, because he convinced Jack I was the guy that would get him into the calculator business, back in the calculator business with CMOS calculators. So the East Coast guys didn't know CMOS, apparently. And where they went, I don't know. I don't know that part of the story. So what happens is Chuck is the one that convinced Jack, if he wants CMOS calculators designs, go to Bill. And Bill can reverse engineer the Toshiba chip that you're using, LC5K3, in your calculators. And Bill and I can come up with a state-of-the-art advanced scientific calculator to get you into the scientific calculator business. And that was what Chuck is out of here mentally. He's doing the pet, well, actually, he's trying to figure out where he's going to do next. That became the 8086 based computer called the Victor 9000, I think. But anyhow, so what happens here is that because of Chuck selling me to Jack, Jack knowing about my background, that's how that came about. So what happens though, I find this out later. Jack was in it to get the Japanese CMOS calculator chip price. The American price was 2x. So Jack was having a trouble competing with others because he wasn't getting the good price. So once we got this LC5K3 working, then he got the Japanese price. So my royalties never happened. And so then when I got the 4500, so the 4500, because Jack never signed the agreement, the 4500 calculator chip, my patent attorney says, that's yours. Really? I did it for them. Well, he never signed the agreement, so he doesn't own anything. Really? Charlie Hoffman's that patent attorney. He worked at Motorola when I got my Motorola patents, and he worked for me after I started my company. So I have about 22 patents. Every one of them were filed by a guy named, first name Charlie. So 2 or 3 of them were back at MOS Technology. It was Charlie Bradley, I think. But anyhow, Charlie Hoffman, Charlie Bradley are 2 of my patent attorneys. So anyhow, that's how that goes together. So when Chuck is thrown out, or no, he quit. He quit Commodore in 1980. So that was the glue that held me to Commodore. So Chuck's out of there, and Jack's going, well, that guy's out of control. And so then they let me out of the exclusive design agreement, which he never signed.
Which he hadn't signed, yeah. So at that point then, did you have any other customers really at that point?
No. I was, it's me being naive. That's why some people would say you don't know what you're doing. It's true. And so I don't have any customers, but I took it one step further. I had decided I can't talk to anyone. I can't pre-sell my ideas. So I didn't talk to anyone. If anybody called, I'm sorry, I'm not available. I tell my secretary, I'm not available. That's when we had secretaries.
Right.
So at
So
that
you've got
point,
basically, yeah.
At that point, I had just bought the office that I have down there at 2166 Brown Road. I had just bought that. And I have a $50,000 balloon payment coming due in 6 months, and every 6 months after that. And I have 0 customers. And you go, and
So
back
this
in
is
those
19.
days, right?
This is 1980, right?
Yeah, and guess what the interest rate on my new house was at that point? The mortgage interest rate. Do you know what it was?
Yeah, that would have been double digits back then.
It was. It was 22% interest on an annual basis. And you go, okay, so that was tough times, right? But I never looked at the bank account because I just needed to find another customer. So who do you think I called? Hello, Bob. Yeah. So I don't have, you know, that Commodore? And I brought them over to you. This is Xerox I'm talking to. I said, so Commodore went away, so I don't have any customers, and I was wondering if you had any work for me. He goes, I want you to get on the next plane to El Segundo, California, LA area. I go, okay. Yeah, I'll do that. So I go over there, and that's when I got the $25,000 check. I'm going, life is good, right?
Yeah.
Now go
That's all
from
big
Commodore.
gold.
Go from Commodore to Xerox.
Mm-hmm.
And you think about Xerox as a company.
Oh, yeah.
You know, the Ethernet, that's theirs. The GUI, that's theirs. Look at all of the inventive people at Xerox.
Oh, yeah.
And they're asking me to help them figure out how to design a microprocessor, right? Then you go, hey, if I didn't have an ego problem before, this would put me over it. And so there you
Yeah.
are.
That
And then
makes sense.
Rockwell Space Shuttle Company, they built the space shuttle, right? They actually were in the microprocessor business with a PPS4 and a PPS8. Parallel processing system is what they called it, not microprocessor. They were probably in there before Intel. So, but they're not known for that. And
Yeah.
hey, I guess when you build things like the space shuttle, microprocessors aren't, yeah, whatever. But Rockwell is one of the best companies that I ever worked with. GTE, Rockwell, NCR, not so much. ITT in Freiburg, Germany, awesome company. Northern Telecom, these are some of the companies I licensed. Sanyo, Seiko, Yamaha, Ricoh. Ricoh is the one I licensed for the Super Nintendo. Anyhow, but so when I went from one customer to 0, and then back to 1, and then there's magic that happened, and this is the Commodore years. So now Commodore is out of the picture again, right?
Right.
And so, well, of course, then I introduced the 6502 CMOS, and I introduced the 816. Well, between the two, Jack or somebody says, Bill must have stolen trade secrets. He couldn't have done that. And so I ended up getting in a lawsuit for a couple of years with Jack. But then Jack's thrown out of Commodore at CES in 1984. So the guy that was head of engineering back east at Commodore decides he's going to go from Las Vegas to Phoenix to Philadelphia. So he comes back. So meanwhile, Brown and Bain is my lawyers, and I've got my attorney. I said, so they want to settle with me now after 2 years. And Brown and Bain, I had a good deal with Brown and Bain because they asked me to teach their lawyer about intellectual property rights. Oh. So I wrote my own agreements. All of that time, what I do is write my own agreements, and then I'd have them reviewed to make sure I didn't violate some law that I didn't know anything about. And so the wording is a big deal. So they would clean up my words, but basically that's how I was teaching Brown and Bain, the #1 law firm for microprocessors in the world. They were the outside counsel. Jack Brown was the outside counsel for Intel. They had their own lawyers inside, but Jack Brown was the outside. So I also had a patent attorney, Cahill, Sutton, and Thomas. They're the ones that, this alternating windshield wipers. They filed the patent for the guy that invented those windshield wipers. But anyhow, they were the original patent attorneys for Phoenix area, which Cahill, Sutton, and Thomas was an awesome patent firm. So anyhow, so I work with them on IP, so then cross-pollinating with Brown and Bain, and so that's how that worked. So when I called Joseph Mott, he was my attorney. Hey, Joe, we got to meet with there's 2 law groups that Commodore had. They had one of the biggest law groups, not Brown and Bain, but another law group there. They want to meet with me because they sued both GTE and me. So we're going to meet this morning and try to figure out how we can settle the agreement. So without any preparation, I show up with one attorney. Commodore has 3 or 4. GTE has another 3 or 4. And because GTE was my accomplice. GTE didn't know anything about microprocessors because I was designing them for them. So they were just deep pockets, right? Mm-hmm. So what happens is I'm in this meeting with the Commodore guy sitting across with his attorneys, and GTE's over here. They're kind of on the sidelines. Joseph sitting next to me. And so this is the dramatic way that we settled the agreement, settled the lawsuit. I go like this. Do you really want to settle? We're going to duke it out, right? And he says, yeah, I really want to settle. I said, okay, I'll tell you what I'll do today. Now, Joseph doesn't know what I'm doing. Joseph's just making sure I don't do something really wrong legally, right? I said, okay, here's the deal. I will give you my license fees. I'll give you half the license fee. So in other words, you pay me for what you want out in my portfolio, but the 816 is not part of the deal. You have to pay full fees for the 816 if you want it. But you're going to pay me, and if you want the PI and CMOS, you want the 02, you want the 22, you want the 21, you tell me what you want, and you get them at half fees. I said, that's the deal. You pay for your attorney fees, I pay for my attorney fees. It's over. This is like how long I'm telling you, this is how long this meeting lasted. He says, can I have a 5-minute break to talk to my lawyers? Yeah. I said, no problem. He leaves with his lawyers, comes back in about 5 minutes. Meanwhile, the GTE lawyer is sitting there and Joe's sitting there going, what kind? And the GTE lawyer said, Joe, did you know about this? Did you talk about this? Joseph says, no, this is all Bill. This is ludicrous. All the lawyers are saying, this is so wrong. You don't do this. What? How do you think this is going to work out for anybody? You're just pissing them off and all this other stuff. They come back. Let's say there were 4 of them, the guy from Commodore and the 3 attorneys, come back and says, accept it. We'll take the deal. I go, great, that works. All right, I'm happy. So the guy from Commodore says, I've never been to your office and I don't have a rental card. Would you mind taking me so I can see your office? And then would you drop me off at GTE? I want to talk to GTE. I go, yeah, sure, let's do it. So I got my car, they got in the car, so I took them to my office and then took them to GTE and said, hey, have a good trip back to Philadelphia. That's how that ended.
Fascinating. So, so then GTE basically just walked away. They ultimately really didn't have any role in the agreement.
Right. And so they just went. I don't know what happened when he visited them and I dropped them off, but I think he just said, "Hey, we don't have really case at all, and so we're done."
Ah, if only more suits could be settled that well.
Well, I had right. I had an unfair advantage. Anytime I got into a negotiation, like I remember in Freiburg, Germany, they got the most snow the night before my meeting with them. The most snow since the end of World War II in Germany.
Wow.
The snow was piled up like that on the streetlights. They cross country skied to work that day. There was a lot of snow. So I'm in this conference room. And they say, well, we like your deal on licensing 6502, but we don't want to pay royalties. Really? Wait a minute. You know that was part of the deal, right? I got on airport in Phoenix and got off here, and you knew what the deal was. We were just coming to sign the documents the way I look at it. So I got my papers, I got my little briefcase, opened up my briefcase, put the papers in. Okay. Well, I'm in the wrong town. So I'm sorry, but this isn't working for me. And so thank you for the invitation. I get up from the table, go to the conference room door to open it. One of the people in the meeting puts his hand on the door. I'm going, what? I'm leaving. No, you're not. We'll take the deal. Oh, okay.
Oh, that's classic. Oh,
So how I got into the fabless semiconductor business?
yeah.
So I'm just licensing companies. So I'm in a meeting with Woz. Woz is sitting across from me. I've got NCR here. I think I had GTE here. And I'm sitting there. And this is a meeting to make sure that Apple had two sources for the 816.
Okay.
Wozniak came back to Apple to do the Apple IIgs, which was called in the papers Apple IIX or something. They had different names for it. They didn't want people to have it. So what happens is, so we're talking, everything's going good. They're going to use it. They're going to build the Apple IIgs. And GT said, yeah, I'm the first source. I'm already licensed. We're good. NCR, who was a licensee of the 6502, says, we're not going to license the 816, so we're not going to be your second source. Bob Jones is the name. I go, Bob, you knew what this meeting was about, right? Fort Collins division of NCR. I said, Bob, this is the whole purpose of this meeting was that we were going to establish two sources for the 816. And you knew you weren't going to be a source before you got on the airplane today. Yeah. So I'm going, oh, this is crazy. Okay, Woz, you have custom chips in your Apple IIs, right? Yeah. And I believe the supplier of those custom chips is AMI, right? I said, you know the quality of AMI. And if anything needed to be revised manufacturing wise, you know that they're getting the best top quality manufactured custom chips, right? Yeah. I said, okay, I will license AMI to build the chips that will be identical to the GTE chips.
Mm-hmm.
So was WC is the second source. And you get to pick the factory. If you want somebody else other than AMI, we'll go there. But at least you have total control of the manufacturing, so you know the quality is going to be equal to what you want. And GT will be the first source. What do you think? Hey, we got two sources. Shake on the deal. Woz, let's go to lunch. Let's go to lunch. That's my only meeting with the Steve twins. I never met with Jobs. I never met again with Wozniak. I've never talked to Wozniak other than that one time. So that's how I got into the fabless semiconductor business. So when I was invited to be on the board of directors of the Fabless Semiconductor Association, I turned them down. Why did I turn them down? Because Sanyo was my licensee and they were my foundry. And I'm going, cultural differences, language differences. They are the best foundry ever. They would build, because they were a licensee of mine, they would build me the wafers. So now GT's first source for my product, and then Sanyo is my second source until I switched to TSMC. But that's why I didn't join them, because I didn't want Sanyo to misinterpret. Wait a minute, why would you join that when don't you like what we're doing?
Right.
I didn't even want to get in the conversation. I just said, no, you guys need to figure it out. I figured it out already. You need to figure it out. And you can figure it out. And so I already have my foundry set up. It's the best foundry in the world. There you have it.
Excellent. So when was that meeting with Woz? I'm trying to remember when the GS was brought out. That was that was late 80s, right?
No. Well, well, it was 1984.
Oh,
I think we might have had the meeting in about 1985.
All right.
I was going to go get an article from the Wall Street Journal. The first page is when they were in March of 1984. There's an article about Apple introducing the Apple IIc that used my 65 CO2.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, the Apple IIe used the CO2.
Okay.
So 84 is when the 816 came out.
Mm-hmm.
So my guess is it was 85 or 86.
Okay.
I probably had the meeting around 85. That's my guess.
All right. That's yeah, my memory obviously was at best fuzzy on that. That was, you said then that you probably were meeting roughly in 85.
Yeah.
And you had done the 816, basically you had come out with it in 84.
Correct.
And that's about the same time frame where was your kind of last contact with Commodore, right?
Well, yeah, 84, it would have been coming back from CES show in 84, which would have been in January. Gosh, I forget what his name was right now. But anyhow, he came back to Phoenix, and that was when we settled. So everything was settled. The lawsuit was probably on for about 2 years. And so what, as it turns out then, I licensed them. on the 02 and I think the 22 and maybe the 21. And so what happens at that point, once I transferred the technology to him, that was the end of our relationship.
So they never used the 816 then?
They never got it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, to be honest, the 816 is something that I want to look at. I just have not ever gotten around to it yet. But it's one I definitely want to look at. And this is going to definitely spark my interest to get a little deeper.
Well, Brian, yeah, that'd be great. Now, I want to tell you something about the 816 that you never been talked about, never written about.
Oh, yeah. Love to hear about
But what happened was Larry Hiddle is who designed the MDT, the microprocessor development terminal for Chuck. Larry and Chuck worked together at GE Computer. Okay. By the way, Larry is who set up the time sharing at Dartmouth back in the 50s, I think, or early 60s. And so Larry started the first terminal company called Courier Terminals. So Larry was just flat awesome. And he helped me with the instruction decode of the 65C02. He didn't help me on the 816. But his son graduated, Paul Hiddle, graduated from Princeton. And then in 1 year, he got his MSEE degree from the University of Arizona in 1 year. And then Paul worked for me for a little bit. I don't know if it was between Princeton and U of A or what it was. But I said, Paul, I'm doing a 16-bit processor, and I'm thinking it wants to be supportive of compilers. The 6502 had a wonderful world of assembly language programming, and most of the games and things were written assembly language.
Right.
And so I said, so I had a professor from the U of A, I think his name was Ted Williams. Interesting name. I think it was Ted Williams, but he taught computer science, I think it was, or engineering at U of A, and he worked for me for a summer. And so I said, and Ted said, you know what's coming out. Now, if you look at when C language started, this was back then. So the C language was just getting started up in the early 80s. And so I said to Paul, so Paul, what do you think I should do about the addressing modes? Because the addressing modes for the 6502 were so much more powerful than the 6800 or the 8080. And that was the power of the 6502. And the fact that you could do high-level languages with the 6502 because of the way we put together the addressing modes and the features. So you could do double precision floating point, and Wozniak did a floating point library for his Apple II, which was really cool. And so I said to Paul, so what should I do with my 816? He said, well, I don't know that much about compilers, but I'd say you need to have strong stack processing. But what you're going to see is a major departure from the 6502 with stack addressing modes. I had somebody working for me who works for Microchip now, and he says, oh, I'd love to be able to program that 816. It's got some features nobody's ever used. So that's where, Brian, the challenge is, think about the compilers, which I don't think my C compilers. Now, the 816 is different than my CO2, so they're two different types of compilers. But I don't think they use the stack addressing modes at all. And you could say, well, maybe the stack addressing modes aren't that good or whatever. But nobody else had that. And my 816 C compiler, the genesis of it was a 68,000 C compiler that was refitted for the 816. So that's some background information about.
Yeah,
If you get involved with it, look at this at the stack addressing.
I'll definitely do that. Well, of course, our objective or our assignment was to cover the Commodore years, and I think that we have done a pretty good job of that. Um, I'm sure there's stories that I haven't thought of the right question to ask. Is there anything that comes to mind that you really would like to share?
Well, one thing, yeah, there is. Jennifer Holt Winograd, who's copied on our emails that we've been exchanging.
Oh, yeah.
Jennifer is someone, I don't know what Jeff and Jennifer or what Jeff's planning to do with other team members, but Jennifer created that website. Have you seen the website?
I have. Yes, it's
So have
quite
you
interesting.
clicked
Yeah.
that little 5-minute video?
Yeah, I've watched
Yeah.
the video and poked through a little bit of the archive stuff she's got up there too.
Yes, she's got awesome stuff that her father collected, Terry, who's still
Yeah.
with us, but he's got some medical conditions. I'm not sure what they all are, but as we get older, you can imagine.
Yeah.
But what I was going to say is that because we're celebrating the 45th year of the 6502 introduction, that I'm saying that one of the things is that Chuck is a magical character. They're doing a documentary on him by a really excellent documentary person that actually documented the Holocaust. And he's out of LA. So I don't know if Jennifer knows who that is, but because we're celebrating Chuck's life and his contribution to the IT industry, the microprocessor world, the personal computer world, that it's important that the message is that Chuck was a magical character. And if it weren't for Chuck wanting to leave Motorola and go to MOS Technology, that story would have never happened. And if Jennifer didn't discover her father's stuff that you've seen on her website, that part of the story would have never been told.
Wow.
And the memorabilia that Terry left MOS with was something I could not have left with. Ray Hurt left with the schematic of the 6502. There's a guy named Dr. Don Hanson. He talked Al Charpentier out of the 6502 schematic for his teaching at the University of Mississippi, Ole Miss. Don and I are in touch with one another. We've had these kind of talks with his two brothers. That's a whole nother story. But I wanted to say that Chuck's contribution cannot be overstated. And the magic that he brought into my life was uncommon. After he left Commodore in 1980, he came back to me in 1992 to do what he called the chunk, a 32-bit version of the 6502 in a module that would plug into a keyboard and a display. And so it was one of these modules that would be, if you look at the hard drive or an SSD drive, just think of that would be plugged into your system. That's what his chunk was about. We never did that. I may have the instruction set that we worked on in 1992. Then Chuck went away for the next 15 years. And he came back in 2007. And we worked, so to speak, from 2007 till he passed.
And that was on the flash controller?
Yeah, the flash controller. he applied for a patent that we did, but we had already documented and signed that we were co-inventors.
Mm-hmm.
But he found a patent attorney in Utah. And after the provisional patent was filed, then my vice president of business development, Dave Kramer, he, poking around on the internet, finds, hey, Chuck's about ready to get a patent on the work that you guys did. What? So I call up his attorney and say, hey, wait a minute. Here's the documentation. I mean, come on. How's that possible? And so the patent attorney sent me information from the patent office, patent and trademark office, that said if you have a dispute on the patent, you can't file it. Meaning that if all of the inventors were not listed on the patent, you can't modify that after you filed it as a provisional patent. You can't add three more inventors.
Huh.
So guess what happens? If I would have asserted what was already signed and documented, Chuck wouldn't have gotten a patent. Nobody would have gotten a patent. The patent attorney probably wouldn't have been compensated because they already knew this information.
Right.
So then I go, oh, wow, that's a bummer. I know what. Chuck needs to have that. That's why he wanted to do it that way. So there's nobody else that has to be in the room where it happened.
Mm-hmm.
So he can negotiate with anybody he wants to negotiate as having the patent rights. But in the backdrop of this, we have to come up with a patent royalty agreement that I get 10% of the proceeds for any license that he creates. So then I'm the one that had to come up with the idea that I will accept the patent royalty agreement even though my name is not on the patent.
Right.
So my last patented or invention was patented by Chuck. So that would be 23. The very first one was patented by John Buchanan. So on both bookends, my inventions that were patented by others, one by John Buchanan and one by Chuck Peddle, kind of sandwiches the other 22. That's an interesting thing. So, but Chuck,
Yeah.
I'm telling you, Chuck was a lovable character. I'm talking about lovable character. He just, he had the energy and the charisma that just said, I want to work with that guy. I want to do something. He's an exciting character. And I would say on the same lines as what Steve Jobs was. And so that's how I think of Chuck. So when his documentary comes out that's funded by his sister, that I never knew he had, I've met his sister on the call, and I didn't even know he had a sister. So Chuck's family relationships were always a mystery to me. And he has family living in the Phoenix area. While he slept for 6 months in my office. You go, how does that all work? But that's where the magic is. I mean, that's that character that just is unusual and creative and made things happen.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's I would say that's a wonderful way to wrap things up, but it has sparked a couple of other thoughts.
Okay.
The first is, it's interesting that you mentioned the 2007 date for that work on the Flash, because just a few years later, in 2010, I went to work for a data storage company. And one of the things that we were looking at is, well, what do the way Flash vendors what did their algorithms imply for what we want to do in terms of how we distribute data across multiple drives and such. So yeah, it's kind of funny how things kind of reconnect sometimes. The other question that I wanted to ask, which is really completely disconnected from the Commodore years, I was curious if that schematic of the 6502, did that come into play with the fellow who has done the monster 6502?
Yeah, yeah. Actually, I helped a little bit with the guys from Canada that did the visual 6502. So the visual
Okay.
6502, I think, is a backdrop of the monster 6502.
All right.
And so the actual transistor schematics of the monster 6502 are the original NMOS. And so that visual 6502 is really the NMOS.
Okay.
But they've also done the 22, and they've also done other processors. So the visual 6502 website has other circuits that they've done that. So I don't know if you were introduced to the, I don't know when it was right now, probably about 10 years ago. There was an archaeology, there's an archaeology magazine for archaeology.
Interesting.
So if you Google archaeology magazine article about the 6502, you'll find it.
Fascinating.
They
I'll definitely check
interviewed
that out.
me. The writer of that article interviewed me here in Durango. And so he was asking, well, how did that come about? And I said, well, actually, there's, I think, the set overflow pin or one of the pins on the chip. They couldn't figure out what was going on there. And they called me. So those Visual 6502 guys that were doing that work called me. And I said, oh, okay, yeah, this is what's going on there, whatever it was. I don't remember specifics. But so what happens there is that I said to the guy that was writing the archaeology article, I said, so can you imagine being over there in Egypt someplace and you hear a whisper from the back room of wherever you're digging in right now? I go, look over there in the corner. That didn't go into the article, but it was one of those, that's how it felt when they were asking me this. And when they were writing the article, it felt like, oh, this is like that mummy that comes awake. Hello, what are you looking for? I know what you're looking for. So, but the article is fascinating article, the way that this guy wrote it. So if you haven't seen it, I would say, it might stimulate some other questions.
Yeah, I will definitely look that up. That's fascinating. Well, I know you've got something coming up in less than half an hour, and I don't want to hold you all day.
No, but you know what, Brian?
Really,
I was thinking, Stephen, when he did, I like to think of it as a conversation more than an interview, because wherever the last comment takes us, maybe the next one takes us in a different way. So an interview is more structured, maybe, but I enjoy the conversation is more than an interview. But what I was going to say is, because I talked with Stephen for probably at least 12 hours, and right now, if you take this recording and find pieces you want to keep and pieces that don't work, and if you find some other questions, we can do this. This works this is comfortable, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you,
I was just going to say, I've really enjoyed this. I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation.
I did too.
I'm looking forward to following up on several of the things that you've mentioned, especially the archaeology article and the stack addressing modes on the 816. I'm really looking forward to looking at those.
Okay, and then I would suggest the other thing that I put in the email is a link to the Smithsonian chips.
Yes, I definitely want to follow up on that.
Yeah, that's fascinating for anyone that's in the like this is part of the vintage computer thing.
Hmm.
I'm saying that Smithsonian is the original, right?
Yeah,
And
right.
so what's on there, I just was introduced to it today, doing a little research for our conversation.
Hmm.
And I found that fascinating. And it's Glenn Madeline. Glenn Madeline was another one of these interesting characters that came into my life in a special time and was another launching pad into my having my own company. And I just wanted to tell you this, that this was the magic of Glenn Madeline. So I'm now not happy because I'm getting migraines talking to 50 people about microprocessors.
Hmm.
And then I trained Kodak engineers, the first Kodak engineers, on designing chips. And migraine headache for a 5-day seminar. Oh, it was awful. And so I knew that working at ICE wasn't really what my cup of tea.
Hmm.
I wanted to be doing things. Denny McClain
Right.
had just won 30 games and then he retires. And that's kind of what I did. I was at the top of my game and then I retired. I want to get back and doing things. And then I'm thinking, and then Jack or Chuck calls me about designing chips for Commodore. And I go, hey, Glenn, I got an opportunity to design chips for Commodore. And he goes, that ain't going to happen. Jack owes me money and I'm never going to do anything with Jack. So then I go back to Chuck and say, hey, I want to design chips here at ICE. Jack comes back with, that ain't going to happen. Glenn ripped me off. I'm never going to do anything with Glenn. So nobody wants to work with anybody. That's how I ended up starting my company because I couldn't do it in a setup with, yeah. So this is now I'm like, oh man, I got 3 kids under the age of 6. I'm just trying to make things work. This isn't working. So I'm at the coffee pot right outside of Glenn's office, and mine's over here. And so I go over to the coffee pot this one morning. Glenn comes out. Glenn says, how you doing? I said, great. Hey, Glenn, what's it all about? And you think, nobody answers that question. What's it all about? Glenn's response was immediate. He says, for me, what it's all about. So he tabled it. For me, what it's all about is you're doing what you want to do, you're living where you want to live, and you're comfortable. Thank you, Glenn. I go back into my office. I go, I'm living where I want to live. I'm not comfortable because my son, who's about 5 months old, 4 months old, was put on a credit card because Glenn didn't have maternity benefits. So it's on a credit card, the birth, all that expense. So I'm not comfortable. And I'm really not doing what I want to do. I want to design integrated circuits. And Glenn thinks that if they don't work, he loses money. And so this isn't working. So I am where I want to, I'm living where I want to live. But the other 2 pieces of his equation just don't match up.
Right.
So that's when I decide, I meet with Jack. And you know the rest of the story.
Right.
But
So
that's
that's
Glenn
when you go to
Madeline.
Las
So
Vegas.
is that, yeah, is that a magical person or not when you ask him a question like that and he has a ready-made answer and it's a good answer? And it's simple. What's it all
It is.
about? Doing what you want to do, living where you want to live, and you're comfortable. He didn't say wealthy, just
Right.
comfortable.
Yeah.
So there you have it.
That is a very wonderful way to look at it, and that's it. Sometimes is amazing, to have those magical people appear at the right time to just really kind of help your life go into the right direction. And
So
it sounds like,
I have another story for you, which might show up in a different time frame, but it's a story
okay,
about ARM. Now, you know, ARM is being acquired by NVIDIA, right, for $40 billion. So I have a
yeah,
wonderful story about ARM. Well, it's for another time.
yeah. I definitely want to hear it.
Okay.
um, yeah, I've certainly. Well, you know, you mentioned when we were having the earlier conversation about the folks from Acorn coming by to visit.
Right.
And of course, I've heard them tell the story as well about how they, you know, come out to do all this research and they meet with you, and you know, their sense was, well, maybe we can design one.
Well, they could. You know what they were missing? The same thing Chuck was missing. And that was they didn't know how, and same thing Xerox was missing. They didn't know how to put it together.
Yeah.
Semiconductor engineering was a missing piece.
Hmm.
Sophie Wilson didn't have that. Steve Ferber didn't have that. Herman Hauser, then once he got the ARM for their computers, he realized what I realized, and that is he could license it
Hmm.
and make a ton of money, which he already had. Herman Hauser apparently had a lot of money because he was an investor. So he had already a lot of money. So he probably made a lot of money off of ARM. And when they went public, it was valued at $10 billion. So now that was in 1998. So 22 years later, it's worth 40 billion.
Yeah.
And so, but that story is there's more to that story. And,
Hmm.
but yeah, so there's videos, you can see YouTube on Herman Hauser, Steve Ferber, and Sophie Wilson. And those three, I want to post those on my website because they tell the story. And when they showed up at my doorstep, they were surprised. They were surprised. You know, I was the first. See, I can keep going. I was the first. I was the keynote speaker for the first IP conference at the raceway in England. It's what's the raceway in England? Horse races.
Oh, okay.
Ascot
Yeah,
Raceway.
Ascot.
They had the first IP conference was there, and I was the keynote speaker. And design and reuse website, you know,
Hmm.
design and reuse, DNR.
Yeah.
The woman that started that was there. She spoke also back then.
Okay.
Anyhow, so
Wow.
lots
Very
of
cool.
history here, lots of fun stories. But
Yes.
we've run out of time.
Yes, I know. It's unfortunate, but yes, I definitely want to hear the other arm stories someday.
I think it'll
But
match
as I
up.
said,
If you've talked to the other people there, then I'd be interested in that as
yeah.
well, what they have to say.
Well, I haven't actually spoken with them. I've seen some of the videos that you've mentioned where they talk about some of that. But yeah, I have not actually met any of them. Though I would love to. There's Yeah, I'm finding that there is so much interesting in the history of our field that, and because it you know moved so fast, so much of it got forgotten and never written down. And you know, going back and finding some of these stories has just been really eye-opening.
But you know, this video that you just recorded,
Mhm.
it can be posted in its entirety, and then maybe after the VCF East happens, maybe the whole thing. And I don't mind doing this just because your curiosity about certain things is different than the next person. But I
Mhm.
feel real comfortable in a conversation with you, and I'm happy to tell what the story the way you want to hear it. I mean, the topics that you want to hear about,
Yeah.
and I'm happy to do that.
Well, I certainly appreciate that, and I look forward to the next time.
All right, all right.
Well, it was
Have a
wonderful
good
talking
one.
to you.
Yeah,
You too.
ditto. Okay, well,
All
later.
right.
Right. Bye.
Bye.